When evangelicals lean left on environment, abortion, population, and poverty, who pushes them? Tonight on From the Stacks, we follow the money. Hayden Ludwig, an investigative researcher for the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C., with a master's in public policy from George Mason University, joins us to peel back the curtain to show the funding behind many parts of the evangelical creation care movement, from the well-known Evangelical Environmental Network and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action to the less-known New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good and the Au Sable Institute. The money trail for left-leaning, professedly evangelical organizations pushing climate alarmism, fear of overpopulation, and abortion rights, sad to say, leads back to major players in the battle to shift America away from its constitutional roots and toward economic and cultural Marxism, while enticing Christians to embrace unscientific, uneconomic, and unbiblical thinking. Stick around. You'll be amazed.
Welcome. I'm Megan Kennard, Director of Operations and Communications for the Cornwall Alliance. We're excited about tonight's program, and I think you will be too. We hope you'll share this with your friends and your followers on Facebook or YouTube or any social platform that you prefer. We're going to ask why some self-professed evangelical leaders who ought to know better have embraced decidedly unbiblical political and economic views related to the sanctity of human life and the environment, particularly climate change.
And I'm Cal Beisner, founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance. Thanks for joining us. Has evangelical environmentalism, aka creation care, grown up as a native plant among American evangelicals? Or is it an invasive hybrid species that overshadows the cross of Jesus Christ, developed and planted by secular scientists and religious liberals, watered and generously fertilized by left-wing foundations that share little or nothing of evangelicals' theological and spiritual commitment, but see them as a voting bloc ripe for the picking? Federal tax returns and other sources reveal a previously hidden history that strongly suggests the latter. 6 years ago, the Cornwall Alliance published a major expose of the funding of the creation care movement. It documented from tax returns, donations totaling over $13.6 million just up through 2014 to 7 leading evangelical environmental organizations: Evangelicals for Social Action, the Evangelical Environmental Network, Creation Care, Inc., Creation Care Fund, the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, of which the Evangelical Environmental Network is one branch, Sojourners, and the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, founded by Richard Cizik after he was dismissed from his position as Vice President for Governmental Affairs at the National Association of Evangelicals for endorsing same-sex unions, but not before Cizik succeeded in pulling the association far along the path toward its present embrace of leftist environmentalism on climate change and other issues. For those of you whose church denominations are members of the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, that's one good reason among many to urge your denominational leaders to withdraw from that and join instead our good friends at the American Association of Evangelicals. You can find out about them at americanevangelicals.com. That's www.americanevangelicals.com.
Tonight, Hayden Ludwig, an investigative researcher for the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C., with a master's in public policy from George Mason University, will help us bring some of that information up to date. It's a tough job because the groups we're looking at, both the left-wing foundations that support them and the recipient organizations, have become adept at hiding the money trail. So though the picture you're going to get tonight is shocking, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Hayden, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Please tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from and how did you become a Christian?
It's good to be with you. Thank you. Well, I grew up in Southern California and currently live in Northern Virginia. Been a Christian for about 4 years. Grew up an atheist, not in a believing household, and discovered when I was about 24 that I was a sinner in need of Christ, in need of saving. And I was blessed enough to have a godly pastor who told me that I couldn't contribute to that. I couldn't do it myself, and I really needed Christ to do that. And since then, I've joined a great church in Northern Virginia, a member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and been working for Capital Research Center, America's investigative think tank, since 2017.
Awesome. Tell us what you do for Capital Research Center and how your Christian faith informs and guides that work.
So Capital Research Center is really unique in that CRC is the only think tank in America whose entire focus is on discovering huge trails of money moving from major donors to left-wing socialist far-left organizations. So that's our entire specialty. We follow foundations, we follow mega donors like George Soros or Tom Steyer that you've heard of. We look how it ends up in the coffers of political parties like the Democratic Party. More importantly, though, we look at the vast network of billions of dollars in major nonprofits, labor unions, and political action committees, PACs. And we're one of the few organizations that does this, and more or less the only organization on the conservative side doing this. And I would say I work with a lot of serious Christians. And while we're not a religious organization per se, we all feel very strongly, if I can speak for them, that we are one of the few lights in the darkness, that we organizations that exist to pull back the veil of darkness and look at the truth underneath it. And my entire job is exposing great lies put on by the other side, great lies about the thing we're talking about this evening, creation care.
That's an exciting job to have. I hope that you will come back on here with us again sometime to expose some more of those lies. Before we dive into tonight's subject, though, we want everyone to know how they can receive a wonderful book from the Cornwall Alliance completely free. As our thanks, when you give a 100% tax-deductible donation of any size, we'll send you a free copy of Don Deere's book, Clexit for a Bright Future, The Case for Withdrawing from the United Nations Climate Treaties. The book explains why it's not enough for the U.S. to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, a withdrawal which will be completed the day after this fall's presidential election. If we're to stop the radical movement toward global government built around the fears of catastrophic man-made climate change, we need to withdraw also from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Don Deeres explains not only why we should, but also how we can do it. We want you to read his book and then tell your elected representatives you want the U.S. out of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. To receive your free copy, you can make a donation of any size through our website, www.cornwallalliance.org, and just request Clexit, C-L-E-X-I-T, in the comments field, or mention promo code 20-08.
Thanks, Megan. Folks, I really hope you'll read that book and then contact your congressmen and senators and even the White House to tell them what you want done about the United States and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Hayden, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I've been using information from the Capital Research Center for, oh my goodness, well over 20 years. I've always found it a tremendously helpful resource, and I'm delighted to know that you're there. And that you and I share a good friend in one of the elders of your church, Dan Griswold. So it's been delightful to catch that bit of background with you too. Now, Hayden, would you just give us some background on creation care? What does it mean?
Yeah, well, creation care it's really a huge deception targeting Bible-believing Christians to get them to support an agenda that they'd never otherwise support. I mean, even the name is a huge euphemism for environmentalist ideology. And that's really the point. This is a serious leftist ideology that has been packaged in a biblical veneer. And it's really a message of wealth redistribution that is sold as honoring creation, loving all of God's creation. We find this in the phrasing that creation care activists use. Many of them are pastors, many of them are self-proclaimed Christians. You'll hear things like, we need to preach the whole gospel, and we need to honor creation. And you have to understand that these are marketing slogans. These are not things that you're going to find in the Bible. They're meant to sound like something you'd find in the Bible so that they can easily be slid into any sermon on any topic in any Christian church. What's entirely absent from this gospel is the good news. There's no good news about it, unless you think socialism is good news. The other thing that's entirely absent is Christ. This is a Christless message in which it reflects perfectly the far left's burn it all down attitude towards anything that far leftists and socialists did not create and do not control.
Well, a lot of the creation care advocates I've run into tend to call what they're into conservationism, sort of trying to stay away from that sort of radioactive term environmentalism. But you don't buy that. You insist on calling it environmentalism. What's the difference between conservationism and environmentalism, and what convinced you that environmentalism, not conservationism, is really what the creation care movement is all about?
Yeah, so I should explain what I mean. They're not synonyms. Conservation is something that we practiced every time we go outside, every time we flush a toilet, every time we do the dishes. Conservation is simple prudence, right? Conservation is, I think of farmers when I think of the ultimate example of conservationists, people who, if they don't know how to use their seeds properly, they don't know how to use water and irrigation properly and the land properly, won't have a crop. This is something everybody practices. And I don't know anybody who doesn't want clean water and clean air. Everybody does. But environmentalism is an entirely separate thing because it's an ideology. It's important to look at where do these two things come from? Because one is really a philosophy, right? What we do, what is wise. And the other is an ideology, which means that it has an end that it seeks. It doesn't start with creation. It starts with an idea about who man is, what man is, and what his relationship to the earth is. And that does not begin in the Bible. It's my conjecture that it actually begins with Karl Marx. And I want to be careful about what I say. It's not to say that anybody who supports creation care or supports something like, taking care of the sick and the elderly, that they're Marxists. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that Marxist thinking shapes the entire framework of the creation care attitude. What I mean by that is, if you go back to Marxist writing, Marx and Engels, they basically theorize that all history can be understood as multiple groups of people fighting each other, constant conflict. They thought that would be the workers and the capitalists. But what we've discovered in the 21st century, of course, is that doesn't work. The proletariat never rises up. What people have figured out instead is if you take groups of people like people who are black or people who are white, people who are one religious persuasion or another, you can create a Marxist conflict, Marxist-style conflict between those two. This is what creation care is predicated on. You should also look at too is how they look at the nature of man and man's relationship to the earth. Christians understand, like conservationists understand, that the earth is a gift to humanity and that we have dominion over the earth. And dominion is a two-way street. Because we're given dominion over it, we are lords on the earth. But we also owe something to the earth itself. We have to look out for it. We have to take care of it. Not that we can destroy it because we're not gods. We're just humans. We're creation. But because we understand that man is sinful since Adam and Eve's fall, we understand that the earth is a flawed place and that most definitely people are flawed and in need of redemption. Now, you look at the genesis of the creation care argument, nothing to do with sin, where Christians look at man and say he's a sinful creature created by a good God in a good God's image. What the creation care and really the environmentalists see is they see, no, man is evil and man is a blight upon the earth. Not that sin is a blight upon man, but man is a blight upon the earth. So it's deeply misanthropic, and it's entirely predicated on this idea that fewer humans is better, which is why I link it back to environmentalism, which in my history, in my reading, comes out of this grander population control movement that is exactly that. Human life is not precious. It's not worth saving.
Well, Hayden, anybody who's followed us at the Cornwall Alliance for a while knows that we talk about funding of evangelical creation care, but not a lot of other people do. What led you to do the research into the funding of evangelical creation care?
Well, my expertise at the Capital Research Center is I mostly look at foundations, which are the upstream, if you will, of money flows into political nonprofit groups. So groups that you may have heard of, like the Sierra Club. These groups do not generate money themselves, and instead they use money to do things, right? They do activism, they do lobbying. But that money all originates from wealthy donors who usually move money through a foundation. It's really an upstream, downstream river is the way I look at it. And within that framework, I like to look at environmentalist groups, specifically those that push for global warming policies. And I also like to look at pro-life organizations, or really pro-choice organizations on the issue of abortion. And there's an interesting point I mentioned earlier of where those two have a confluence, and that's in the population control movement. And you have to go back a few decades to really see where this comes from. But if you went back to the 1950s, 1960s, even before then, what you'd find is the origins of all the folks like Greenpeace, right, who seem to have nothing to do with abortion. It's all about save the polar bears, right? What you find is their forefathers, just a generation before, are the people who come out of a movement pushing eugenics, pushing abortion, forced sterilization. This is the origins of Planned Parenthood. In tracing all this foundation spending, I came across some of the groups we're going to talk about tonight, such as New America Foundation and the Evangelical Environmental Network. These are groups that they exist at that confluence of the pro-life issue, which is very much a religious and moral issue, of course, and environmentalism. And you find a really fascinating group of organizations that speak a different language than their more radical Greenpeace, Sierra Club, environmentalist, tree-hugging types, if you will. They speak a different language from those people, and yet they share common ancestors. They share serious roots. And really, their agenda is almost identical if you really follow through what they're saying.
Wow. Well, before we get to the New America Foundation, which I want to ask you about, I just want to welcome all of those who are joining us right now. I know some of you have just hopped on. I'm Megan Kennard, Director of Communications with the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Our website's www.cornwallalliance.org. I'm here with Cornwall founder Cal Beisner and with Hayden Ludwig, an investigative researcher for the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. Now, Hayden, you have written about a think tank called the New America Organization Institute. It's orchestrating much of the creation care strategy. I suspect most of our viewers have never heard of them. Can you tell us more about the group? Who's behind it? Are there any recognizable names?
Yeah, it's not surprising most people have not heard about it because it's really the ultimate DC insiders think tank. And there are a number of those, so that's saying something. You'd know some of the members of its board. Its board of directors used to consist of, included Fareed Zakaria, the CNN anchor, very liberal gentleman who does a lot on foreign policy. It also included Eric Schmidt, who was a longtime Google CEO. So these are people who are power players, and they're very closely involved with media and technology companies. But the think tank itself, it's interesting. New America sees itself as very partisan, but it's not. Like Creation Care, it's basically a deception. It's actually a left-wing organization. It's a left-wing think tank created, run by veterans of the Obama administration. They're basically Democratic operatives. They're partisans with a political axe to grind. The founder is a gentleman named Ted Halstead. He's an environmental activist, and like New America, he's kind of a fake moderate. He proposes things that we'll talk about, but called transpartisan appeals. That is, not simply bipartisan, where you get members of both parties, but rather you find little chinks in the armor of both parties, and you create interest groups in both the Republican and Democratic parties, so that there's a coalition of folks that transcends the two parties. It's kind of a complicated thing, but that's what they're premised on. Ted Halstead's interesting in the whole environmentalist world because he actually left New America some years ago and founded another think tank called the Climate Leadership Council. This is part of a set of organizations that I've really spent a lot of time studying called the eco-right. And it's kind of what it sounds like. These are people who call themselves environmentalist conservatives. And they're really not. What they are people who come out of the Republican Party establishment. Many of them are ex-Republicans. I think Halstead might be one of them. But the eco-right folks, they effectively buy into the left's basic argument about global warming. And that is that the Earth is only getting hotter and that it's getting dangerously hot and that it's mankind's fault. Therefore, mankind has an obligation to do something now to fix it. But their solution, what sets them apart from, say, the Green New Deal folks on the far left, is that the eco-right tries to propose quote unquote free market alternatives to this. What that really means is kind of the same thing as the left asks for. More subsidies of green technologies. You remember Solyndra from the Obama years, more of that stuff. My favorite example is a carbon tax, which would tax almost literally everything that you own. It's a tax on carbon emissions, and the carbon emissions come from burning gasoline and coal, which of course means if you truck anything or drive, you're taxing all of that. So it's a tax on almost everything except the air you breathe. But this is the kind of organization that Halstead is known for. So New America is really one of the two major groups that I've traced that's spearheading the intellectual part of the Creation Care campaign. Creation Care is bigger than just these two groups because it exists in a lot of mainline denominations. A lot of Protestant and Catholic denominations, the more liberal ones, have often accepted this. Christianity Today, Billy Graham's old magazine, has sadly accepted this, and you can find countless articles on Creation Care about how wonderful it is on Christianity Today. Rather, what New America's role in this whole thing is after the first Creation Care campaign failed in the mid-2000s, it really lingered for a long time. And the second Creation Care campaign started when some people at the New America Foundation started analyzing what went wrong with the initial Creation Care campaign. What they concluded from this autopsy is they found that the first Creation Care thing tried to take what was widely perceived as a liberal issue, it's global warming, and tried to rebrand it to be a centrist issue, a moderate issue. And the idea there is, well, we already have a lot of liberals on our side. We don't need to convince those guys. What we need to do is we need to convince conservative evangelicals and Catholics to support this. And they're not going to do that if they think it's a liberal issue. So we'll call it a centrist issue. And it didn't work. It failed abysmally, even though they got some support from mainline churches. What New America discovered was, yeah, but if you do that, but instead of trying to get that bipartisan appeal, where you get Democrats and Republicans or liberals and conservatives behind this, instead what you can do is you can say, no, this isn't a centrist issue. Global warming is a conservative issue, or rather, it's a Christian issue. In which case, you don't have to sell Christians on becoming more moderate on this issue. Rather, you can say, you already believe what we believe. This is actually all about stewarding the earth. This is about honoring the creation. That's where those terms come from. That's the goal they've been embarking on. And it's shocking how public they are about this. I wouldn't have known about this except that I was tipped off to look at some very publicly available documents about huge policy papers published by New America stating this is what we need to do. We need to infiltrate these people. And their final goal is very plain as day. It is to break off evangelicals as a voting bloc from the Republican Party, which is, when you think about it, a really fascinating goal for a 501c3 tax-exempt organization to pursue.
Yes, it is. Well, back in 2015, New America published a major report called Spreading the Gospel of Climate Change, an Evangelical Battleground. A major theme was trying to explain why, after a wide variety of left-leaning foundations had spent many millions of dollars trying to get evangelicals on board the global warming bandwagon, evangelicals remained the most skeptical segment of the American population. We're kind of proud of the fact that a major part of their answer was the Cornwall Alliance. So in a press conference introducing that paper, New America's Heather Hurlburt unintentionally revealed something really shocking about about how New America and its allies think about the evangelicals they've managed to bring on their side. And here's a clip to show that.
To give the impression of the moral high ground, The Soros Network funds what they call evangelical and Catholic mascots to serve as surprising validators for their anti-Christian projects and candidates. Imagine the evil of using a Christian front to de-Christianize the culture and nation. In this video clip from the New America Foundation, an executive admits their rent an evangelical model of social change.
Doing a sort of rent an evangelical, as we used to call it on the national security side, rent a general model.
The network funds religious groups including Jim Wallace's Sojourners, PICO, Faith in Public Life, Faithful America, Richard Cizik's New Evangelical Partnership, Telos, J Street, National Council of Churches, Evangelicals for Human Life, Catholics United, Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good, Catholics for Choice, and through the network's National Immigration Forum, they fund religious groups advancing open borders, amnesty, and voter registration for their new America. Are these groups transparent about the Soros Network funding? Not typically. In a 2010 interview, Reverend Jim Wallace, a longtime leader of this movement, was asked if his Sojourners was funded by Soros. Here is Reverend Wallace's response in his own voice.
No, we don't receive money from Soros. No, I mean, the financial crisis that nonprofits are in, including us. Why is it he should call Soros and ask him to send us some money? No, we don't receive money from George Soros. Our books are totally open, always have been. Our money comes from Christians who support us and who read Sojourners. That's where it comes from.
Soon, grants from Soros to Wallace disappeared from the Open Society website. But when journalists found the money trail, Wallace was forced to admit the truth. Rather than advancing the whole counsel of Scripture as the highest love for people and culture, these useful ministers assist non-Christian policies, projects, and politicians with faith works, optics, organizing, and media to confuse Christian and other value voters, to recruit the church into their radical political agenda, and to help the left's politicians get elected.
Rent an evangelical. Hayden, what does that tell you about the intentions of those at New America and about the discernment on part of those they're renting?
It tells me they're very cynical indeed. And I'm shocked that they'd even say something like that in a public place. It shows you the kind of caliber of people we're dealing with on the other side. Very devious. What I find is, like I said, my expertise is in tracing money from these huge foundations. George Soros, I spent a month looking at all the grants that George Soros's Open Society foundations and similarly named Foundation for an Open Society have spent, and it's billions. In the last 2 decades, I think it's close to $6 billion that those two organizations have spent. And it's all his money. And you notice, too, in that clip early on New America's website, Jonathan Soros, that's one of George Soros's sons. He has a number of children. They're pretty much all very politically involved. And Jonathan Soros is one of the guys who's likely to basically succeed George Soros as the kingpin in that empire. The thing is, though, bigger than that, huge foundations like the Energy Foundation fund all sorts of groups. The Evangelical Environmental Network got huge sums of money, 6-figure grants on a regular basis from the Energy Foundation. If you look at the Energy Foundation, it looks like this really nice philanthropic organization that just sends money to really good causes. But if you look behind the scenes where it gets its money, it turns out that the Energy Foundation was created and is almost entirely funded by 3 major left-wing foundations. It's the Pew Charitable Trusts, like the Pew that you always hear about with the polling and research, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Those are 3 names that I see in almost any topic that I've ever dealt with. I mean, no kidding. You can name a topic, and those groups you'll probably find funding in there. 4th one would be the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which is the foundation of the late co-founder of HP, Hewlett-Packard. And it is another organization that funds all these groups. It's actually one of the single largest organizations that funds the eco-right. That's the environmentalist conservative groups that I've traced millions of dollars from that organization. So what it tells me is not only are these people cynical, but it's entirely creation care, that is entirely a product of the professional left. Look at every day. There's There's nothing grassroots about this. There's nothing that your average pastor has just come to this conclusion that, gee, I really think global warming exists in the scriptures. No, this is something that's created in Washington, D.C. and disseminated by people who know what they're doing, who are very well funded, bankrolled by guys like George Soros. So I can tell you his intentions are probably not to spread the scriptures, to spread the love of Christ. And they're absolutely spreading this stuff, knowing exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, one of the most prominent creation care groups is one that you've just now mentioned, that I mentioned a little while ago, the Evangelical Environmental Network. I mentioned before that it's part of the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, or the NRPE. Well, the NRPE was founded in 1993 in response to an open letter to the American religious community, focusing primarily on global warming, clear back in 1992 and 93, by 32 Nobel laureate scientists, spearheaded by the atheist Marxist astronomer Carl Sagan, famous for his Cosmos TV series on PBS, and James Parks Morton, the New Age Gnostic Revival dean of the Episcopal Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, who used to hold baptismal ceremonies for animals from the city zoo. Now, in the Cornwall Alliance's 2014 paper, Evangelical Environmentalism, Bought and Paid For by Liberal Millions, which is available on our website, www.cornwallalliance.org, I documented nearly $9 million in funding to the NRPE from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, two that you've just mentioned, and several other left-wing foundations, and over $1.5 million to the Evangelical Environmental Network, or EEN, from Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Energy Foundation, which is funded also, by the way, by billionaire Tom Steyer, who ran for the Democratic nomination for president this time around, didn't get too far on it, got his money out of primarily the coal industry, and then suddenly became a major proponent of solar and wind. All of these funding sources and more are major supporters of abortion on demand, which they justify in part by saying that it will help us slow population growth. And they're also major supporters of drastic actions to fight global warming or climate change. My paper, Hayden, dealt with funding only up to 2014. You've been looking at more recent years, and as we mentioned, particularly the role of New America. What is the EEN's connection to New America?
Well, yeah, you're right. And the funding just continues through the last 6 years since then. EEN is the group that I kind of hinted at before when I said that New America is spearheading the left's second creation care campaign. EEN created and ran the first creation care campaign. You mentioned this back in the 90s through the 2000s, and it was an abysmal failure, as I said. It didn't go the way they wanted to. But they continue doing this, and they're one of the groups that are leaning on New America's new strategy here for pushing creation care under kind of a different guise. What part of that strategy I've seen between EEN and New America is trying to rebrand the term pro-life by expanding the definition of pro-life. And I've heard many stories from mutual friends, people who've been subjected to this stuff, they've tried to infiltrate churches. And they've told me things like their new definition of pro-life includes everything except for the fact that life starts at conception. I mean, that's hardly pro-life. The idea is that we can include things like, well, mercury poisoning is bad for babies. Ergo, coal-burning power plants, which emit tiny, tiny, tiny particles of mercury, we need to shut those down because they're going to destroy the planet. And that's not very pro-life, right? Or if you were really pro-life, you'd support, all of these land redistribution policies or land conservation policies by the federal government. Things like that really stretch the idea, and they're pretty transparent on that. They're obviously not what pro-life is all about. That's my point. If they can redefine pro-life to mean anything. It doesn't mean anything at all. The way I've come to see the EEN, the Evangelical Environmental Network, is really, it's a lefty policy shop more than anything. And if you follow their news section, they put out press releases all the time condemning things that congressional Republicans have done, that President Trump has done, and then very loudly advocating things for that congressional Democrats and President Obama did all the time. They were big advocates in 2015 of Obama's clean energy plan, which, let's not forget, this is the thing that President Obama told us is going to necessarily cause electricity rates to skyrocket, because it would artificially reduce the amount of coal and other fossil fuels that we use to get our electricity, and everybody's electricity bills go through the roof. They do that, and they said so. They thought it was a great idea. EEN endorsed it. They've endorsed various carbon taxes pushed by both liberal groups and groups on the eco-right, like that of Climate Leadership Council. That's Ted Halstead, the founder of New America's Group, right? So what you begin to see is all of these organizations know each other. They absolutely follow each other because they have the same strategy, and they work very closely together. And even outside of this particular issue area, I can tell you from my years of doing this that the left, if you'll pardon the term, is very incestuous about this. They don't operate in a vacuum. That's why when you take something like creation care, you can't take it as a given that they're really talking about the issue, because the issue that they're really talking about is the greater issue of power and money and control, right? It's really about how do we achieve the aims of the environmentalist movement. The environmentalist movement is completely removed from Christianity. I just wish these people would be honest and say so.
Yeah, I should have thought of this before the program, but I actually wrote a short book about how some of the folks in the creation care movement have redefined what it means to be pro-life, and the Cornwall Alliance publishes that. And at the moment,
and I've
my
read it.
wonderful brain can't even remember the title of the book that I wrote. Maybe Megan could remember it, but if you go to
it's on our website.
cornwallalliance.org, pardon, Megan?
It's on our website. It's in the store.
Yeah, it's in the store at cornwallalliance.org. Just go there and click on shop, and you'll see it. It's pretty obvious. Well, I'd like to dig a little deeper into that quote from Heather Hurlbert, the one where she referred to Renton Evangelical. To really get its point, we need to see it in its context. She said that her project to figure out why the effort to bring evangelicals on the global warming bandwagon hadn't worked, for which she blamed the Cornwall Alliance, and for which we're very grateful to take the blame. And she began by talking to her. She said that project began with her and two co-authors writing, and I'm quoting now, an article looking at how do you get anything done? How do you move any policy and advocacy in the era of partisan polarization? And when we hypothesized, I'm still quoting here, quite a long quote, when we hypothesized that there were 3 or maybe 3.5 different paths that one could choose. And I think I hear each of you, that is the 4 others on the panel, Lydia Bean, Steve Tellis, Ted, whatever his last name was, and Jerry Taylor, saying, there's really only one path, and you're not each saying it's the same path. So I want to ask you each what your theory of change is, in a way, because what we said was sort of, you could put your resources into sort of a 20-year campaign to change public sentiment. And what both Lydia and Jerry, the 2 sociologists who wrote that major study, are saying is definitely that doesn't really matter. You can rely on the traditional bipartisan coalition building, which entails getting the great and the good together and doing a sort of Renton Evangelical, as we call it on the national security side, rent a general model. Or you can do a purely partisan, pick a side. Republicans are never going to be serious about climate change, and we're going to fund the heck out of Democrats till, they take back the House, which might be a 40 or 50-year project. And then there's the transpartisan, we're going to collect strange bedfellows. We're going to sort of sneakily break down both coalitions from inside, which I hear some skepticism about as well, or at the very least, Ted, what you seem to be saying is you have to create a different transpartisan coalition than this one. So, and she concludes this way, if you had some of the funders that were feeding us on here and you were asked to advise them on how to invest their next $5 million or $10 million, what strategy would you use? Now, Hayden, what does all that reveal about the tactics of the left's major funding organizations to draw evangelicals into their camp? It looks to me
I
like
wish.
it's all about how to use money to get individuals and organizations to embrace policies. It's not about persuasion. It's not about logic and evidence. It's about money. Now, what does that say about the credibility of organizations that jumped onto the bandwagon like EEN, Creation Care Fund, Jim Wallace's Sojourners, Ron Sider's Evangelicals for Social Action, or Rich Cizik's New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good?
Yeah, I was going to say, gee, I wish it was only $5 to $10 million that we were dealing with instead of a virtually unlimited money pot that these guys have. And I'm really not even joking, really. I'll point out too, as part of my answer, if you notice the man sitting on the furthest right, Jerry Taylor, he's the head of a group called the Niskanen Center. Niskanen Center is part of that eco right I've alluded to a few times, but he's really important for illustrating the kind of people who are attracted to this issue. That is trying to fool evangelicals into supporting something they wouldn't otherwise support. Taylor's background is that he used to be a really good libertarian writer for the Cato Institute, the big libertarian think tank in DC. Yeah. But he basically defected and became one of the left's most beloved apologists for global warming theory. And so his entire focus since then, and he's been shifting further to the left, by the way. Now he endorses George Soros's open society ideology, which is the ideology of a former communist and very much a guy named Karl Popper, who very much opposes free market capitalism. Anyway, it shows you something about who they turn to try and get insights into how conservative evangelicals think. I think that's very revealing. What the whole point of this thing is, like I said, is listen to what they're saying, what they're not saying. They're mocking the idea of trying to actually inform people. They're mocking the idea of, well, we think we've got the right answer and want to go and convince you Christians because you obviously don't agree with us. And we want you to understand why global warming is such a big deal, why all these climate change is such a big deal, and you should agree with us. They've basically said, we've given up on that. It didn't work last time. So now we're going to infiltrate. Now we're going to fool. Now we're going to rebrand. And so we'll turn to the big guns who've been among Christians, who've been Republicans and conservatives, and ask them, how do we go about doing this? Basically, they're turning to mercenaries. This is the tactics of deception. It reminds me a lot of some of the things that the Saul Alinsky back in the 60s taught modern left-wing activism. This is where modern left-wing activism comes from. It comes from guys like Alinsky. It comes from professional environmentalist agitators. Alinsky would do things like, and tell me if this doesn't sound familiar, he would plant people in Republican politicians when they'd hold a rally. He'd plant people there wearing things like KKK garb. Now, these weren't really KKK members or racists or extremists, but their job was to make the entire thing tarnished, to start fights to make it look like the Republican who's running is an evil person, right? This is the kind of stuff that they do. It's all about, we can't convince them, we'll deceive them. And it's the entire point of the creation care argument. They don't really turn to scripture. Instead, what they do is they turn to arguments that are entirely feeling-based because they want to appeal to Christian conviction to find fellow Christians and to find fellowship among people. It's natural for people, especially Christians, to look for others who are like-minded. And when you find a group that professes something different from you and says, well, wait, I have a different view on global warming, it's going to cause you to wonder why. Well, maybe I've just been wrong this entire time. But what if they presented themselves as what they really are? And I can't speak for their souls. I'm not saying they're believers. I'm not saying they're Christians. But the organizations that they're allied with, the organizations that fund them should tell you a lot about their intentions. I've always wondered, facetiously, but I've always wondered, these folks on the creation care side, these folks on the eco-rights side, they want to tell you that they're genuine Christians who care about Scripture. They want to tell you they're genuine conservatives who care about conservatism. And yet, why would you go to the left, guys like George Soros, who care for neither of those things, in fact, spits on them? Why would you go for them for funding? You know, if you really want to convince people that you're genuine, that you really think your arguments are good, then have that debate. If you really think that your arguments will be understood by evangelicals, then explain them that way. But don't go to the other side. The reason that they do that, though, is because there's no funding base on the evangelical Christian side or the Roman Catholic side, conservative Catholic side, to find this, which is why groups like the Niskanen Center, Jerry Taylor, groups like EEN and New America, they have to go to the left to find money, because only the left is interested in these groups doing the left's bidding.
Yeah, you know, you remind me of the Apostle Paul having written in 2 Corinthians, bad company corrupts good morals. And that's exactly what we need to keep in mind. You know, alliances need to be very, very carefully considered. And we need to do, as Paul also tells us, test all things, hold fast what is good. Hayden, thanks so much for giving us that bit of insight. Hey, folks, don't forget to ask for your free copy of Don Deers's book, Klexit for a Brighter Future, The Case for Withdrawing from United Nations Climate Treaties. As Megan said before, it explains not only why we should, but also how we should get the U.S. out of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. To receive your free copy, make a donation of any size through our website, www.cornwallalliance.org, and just request Klexit in the comments field mentioning promo code 2008.
Cal, the title of your book that is on our website is How Does the Creation Care Movement Threaten the Pro-Life Movement? And it's on our website store at www.cornwallalliance.org. I hope everyone who's watching, if you haven't seen the whole thing, you'll go back and watch from the beginning. If you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the comments section on Facebook. Hi, Keith. It's good to see you again. We will answer those questions, so go ahead and ask them. What I hope you're getting from this program, what I'm getting,
answers in right at the moment, we'll answer them at some point.
Yeah,
you know?
we will.
So
we will
come back and see.
Definitely. And what I hope you're getting from this program, at least what I'm getting from this program, is the utter hypocrisy of a lot of funders, people like Soros. He has kids, but yet he funds abortion, population control measures, policies for other people. It's not okay for them to have kids. Also, I want to point out, it's often those policies are implemented in places like Africa and India. So it's really more of a racist hypocrisy going on here. But another very important creation care organization, though unlike the Evangelical Environmental Network, it's not often in the news, and it doesn't do a lot of public relations marketing work for its ideas, is something called the Au Sable Institute. Cal, what can you tell us about Au Sable, and particularly how it reaches into Christian colleges to shape young Christians' minds about creation care?
Well, the Au Sable Institute was founded by Dr. Calvin E Witt, an ecological scientist who also had a hand in starting the Evangelical Environmental Network and has been a major influence in the thought of the entire creation care movement. Au Sable runs biological, ecological, educational courses for Christian students at many different Christian colleges. And actually a fair amount of the education that they do and that sort of thing in basic ecological biology is pretty good stuff. So one needs to be even-handed and fair. Au Sable Institute is not nearly as partisan, politically partisan and ideologically driven as is the Evangelical Environmental Network. And yet, Recently, the Cornwall Alliance published my book, Creation Stewardship, Evaluating Competing Views, which subjects de Witt's thinking to careful biblical and scientific analysis. Creation Stewardship, Evaluating Competing Views is available also through the Cornwall Alliance's online bookstore at www.cornwallalliance.org/shop if you want to go directly there. What I show is that in many instances, Dr. de Witt and he and I share the same the same name, Calvin, and we're both in the Reformed theological tradition, and actually we have a lot of shared loves. Nonetheless, when it comes particularly to the climate change issue, I think Dr. de Witt simply accepts pretty much uncritically most of the ideas out of the entire global warming alarmist movement as it's pushed by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by the Democratic Party here at home, by the European Union, by Al Gore and folks like that. And so I think it's very important that Christians carefully distinguish between sometimes the good work that some Christian environmentalists or Christian creation care advocates do, and the not so good work that they also sometimes do. Dr. de Witt was also one of the primary authors of a document released in 1994, pretty much under the auspices of the National Religious Partnership on Environment and the Evangelical Environmental Network, called let's see, an Evangelical Declaration on the Care of Creation. I've got a funny little story about that. The then vice president of National Association of Evangelicals, the then vice president for governmental affairs of them, actually received a copy of that and was asked to endorse it. And he knew me, he knew of my work in this field. And so he sent me a copy of it and asked me to give him my thoughts about it. And I said, you know what? About 95% of this is actually quite good stuff. The problem is in some of its empirical claims, and those had to do with what Cal de Witt has for years called the 7 degradations of creation. And I just simply pointed out to him that on all 7 of those, the empirical claims that they were making in this document, for example, that there was vast loss of U.S. cropland going on, and that the quality of cropland on American farms was declining rapidly, and erosion was depleting it, and the minerals were being sucked out of it because farmers were not using it properly. I just simply pointed out that the actual hard data from the U.S. Soil Conservation Service showed exactly the opposite, that the quality and the extent of U.S. farmland were rising rapidly. There were many other specific instances of that kind of thing. And what happened in response to that, and I wrote that up in an article for World Magazine, what happened in response to that was that Cal de Witt basically complained and said, here I am on the front lines trying to represent Jesus, and you're shooting me in the back. Now, essentially, that's what logicians call an appeal to pity, right? He didn't actually respond to the substance of what I had said at all. And of course, my response was, hey, look, I'm just simply wanting us to be truthful, to be factual, to get at the hardcore evidence in this sort of thing. I think that's very important, and I think it's, unfortunately, it's something that many people in the creation care movement do not carefully do. They do not test all things, hold fast what is good, as Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Well, let me move on from that. Hayden, you've written pretty extensively on the history of environmentalism and its connection to pro-abortion and population control groups, including Planned Parenthood, both in America and around the world. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. Can you just develop that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, I kind of hold that that modern environmentalism, what we see in these kinds of organizations like Greenpeace, Sierra Club, the U.S. Climate Action Network, U.S. CAN, all of this kind of activism has a common ancestor in the population control movement, which itself really is just an expression of the early abortion movement. So I spent quite a while reading through everything I could find by and on Margaret Sanger. Not something I'd recommend to most people. And what I discovered is Sanger actually plays a really key role in, I think, understanding a lot of why activism today is what it is, and how these people think. That and something to do with Vladimir Lenin as well. Not that the two are the same thing. The reason I say that is because Sanger, Margaret Sanger had going back to the environmentalism thing, Margaret Sanger had a pretty well-developed ideology that's usually forgotten. Most people remember her as the founder of Planned Parenthood. She was. But she had a full ideology that wasn't simply socialism. It wasn't simply abortion or progressivism. She called it capital B birth control. And birth control ideology, like environmentalism, is really Marxist in the way that it assumes things. In this case, it assumes a conflict between men and women. And there's a little truth to this in a time when women who could get pregnant were facing, in a lot of cases, their own grave. So it comes out of some grain of truth, but it's spun wildly out of control. But the key thing you can take away from that is that Margaret Sanger taught a coalition of people who weren't necessarily on the same page as her with abortion and contraception. She taught them something really critical about political activism, and that is how to organize as a single unit. So if you look at the early coalition of these population control folks, you had people who supported eugenics. You had people who supported forced sterilization, Sanger among them. I've actually quoted her as saying we need mass sterilization to curb population control. And then you had early advocates of abortion who were really the second wave feminists coming out of France and the United Kingdom from the late 1800s, early 1900s. What all these groups of people had in common, plus socialists who joined in all of this, was not that they believed exactly the same thing, but rather that they had enough in common that they could basically be in the same tent. What Sanger's really genius thing was saying, look, all eugenicists and population control folks and sterilization folks, you're not going to get everything that you want, but you can get something that you want. The only way you're going to get something that you want is if you have enough political power in the states and in Washington, D.C. So if we all align together, we can all get a little bit of something of what we want. But the only way we win on any issue is if we all win on one issue. And you flash forward almost 100 years. And I've been to many, many left-wing protests to the Supreme Court and the Congress to cover these things. And I can tell you from a lot of experience, when you find groups there, you don't just find the Service Employees International Union. You don't just find the AFL-CIO, CIO. You don't just find Planned Parenthood. You find every kind of left-wing organization you can find, groups that protest the courts, all the way to labor unions, all the way to global warming groups, immigration groups. And they all chant the same line, my body, my right, save the planet, we've got a dozen years left to live. Why do they all chant the same thing? Why do they all do that? It's not necessarily because they all believe just as fervently. The AFL-CIO, for instance, doesn't stand to win a lot if the Green New Deal goes through. It probably stands to lose. Rather, it's that they've taken something, even unwittingly, from what Sanger realized back in the 1920s and 30s, and that's that the entire left stands together and wins something, or the entire left loses something. That's really important because when you see early environmental activists in the 1960s, they didn't understand this. Historically, what we find is the first person to begin any kind of organized environmentalism is Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring in the 1960s. And that really kind of awoke a lot of people that there's a large number of people, mostly on the hippie camp, of course, but a large number of people in America who are very concerned about something to do with the environment. It wasn't very clear. It was a very poorly written, poorly researched book, but it made a lot of ground for people, covered a lot of ground. The next big thing that came out in 1968, I believe, it was a guy named Paul Ehrlich. And Ehrlich was a biologist, if I remember right. Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, in which, this is 1968, he believed that by the 1970s, pretty much everybody alive in his day would be dead from overpopulation. And that was a huge concern. Where did he get overpopulation? He gets it from the logical thing in common, I guess you could say, the logical common ground between all of the early supporters of Planned Parenthood and abortion, namely that there's too many people. This is the problem. Eugenics and abortion supporters that modern Planned Parenthood is yet to shake. And that is, eugenicists were very concerned about what kind of people got to reproduce, and Margaret Sanger and her allies were very concerned about how many people got to reproduce. And I have reams of stuff I've read about her going to China, her going to the Soviet Union, and talking about how there's too many Chinese, and that's China's greatest problem. Or my favorite one, going to the Soviet Union in 1934, where she was led by an evangelical pastor, an American evangelical pastor, also a communist. And she investigated all of their abortion clinics and found them to be, the wave of the future. What they have in common is this idea that there's too many people. And it goes back to environmentalism's basic misanthropic attitude towards man, why it's incompatible with Scripture. If you follow that all the way through to the 1960s and 70s, what we begin to see is people took this idea of like there's something wrong with humans, there's too many of us, and they ran with it, and they started organizing, which is where you get the idea of global cooling in the 1970s, and then it's global warming in the 1980s. Now my favorite term for it is climate weirding, because they can't come up with a nice term. The point being, you can see a line that goes all the way back through the last 100 years, starting with the progressive. There's a reason why anybody who looks at creation care and is moved by it, thinks that there's something to it, ought to consider not only who supports it today, who funds it today, but also where does this intellectual tradition come from? It doesn't exist in a void. It may shock a lot of your listeners to learn, for instance, that the first modern government to adopt environmentalist policies as we recognize them was actually the Third Reich. And I've read this before. It's fascinating. Absolutely. That in the early 1930s, the Völkischer Beobachter, which is it's the People's Observer, it's the Nazi Party newspaper. So obviously, not a source of truth. It's all propaganda. Had a glowing piece about how one of the first things that the new Nazi regime was going to do was install one of the world's biggest wind turbines, because that's the wave of the future for Germany. That's what fascism gets you in Germany, is wind turbines. They would have had solar panels too if they had them back then, I'm sure. My point isn't that these are Nazis that we're dealing with or socialists or anything crazy like that. It's simply to show that, wow, they have strange bedfellows for a group that calls themselves evangelical Christians. We need to know that.
They do indeed. Yeah, the population control movement really, I think, is what is kind of at the very root of most of this. I wrote a lot about that myself back in the 1980s in my book, Prospects for Growth, A Biblical View of Population Resources in the Future, which also, by the way, is available on Cornwall's website at cornwallalliance.org. And I just wondered, Hayden, in all of your reading on this, whether you had read the really amazing book by Matthew Connelly called Fatal Misconception, The Struggle to Control World Population. Connelly is a Harvard scholar, historian, and he set out to write a book that would really celebrate the population control movement. He thought it was doing wonderful stuff, that it really needed to be lauded and applauded by people all over the world for all the good that it was doing. And because he was taking that approach to it and was quite forthright about that in approaching the various different population control organizations, they gave him full access, many of them, to all their archives. And as he read through their reams and reams and reams of papers, he was horrified. He discovered the racist, the eugenicist, the anti-human ideologies that lay behind this. He saw the roots, not just in Thomas Robert Malthus, the author of an essay on population back in 1798, not just in Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, but also in Darwin's cousin's book, title I forget at the moment, that was really the root of the eugenics movement, which inspired the thinking of both Margaret Sanger and Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler took the eugenicist thinking of social Darwinism through Darwin's nephew and his book and wove it into Nazism. Connolly did all this research, and he was just paralyzed with regret about all of this movement. So he winds up writing this big fat history of the population control movement called Fatal Misconception: The Struggle to Control World Population. It's a book that I read about a decade ago, and it has stayed with me ever since as one of the most profound works in this field. Are you familiar with that book yourself, Hayden?
I am. Oh yeah, terrific tome, but it's terrific. Yeah, and just to show you, by the way, you mentioned Darwin's cousin. To bring this full circle, that was Francis Galton, I believe you're referring to. And Galton
That's right.
actually worked
Right.
in New York in the 1910s, 1920s. This is a time when progressives, the same people today, right? This is a time when progressives were proudly racist. In fact, Francis Galton was funded by the Rockefeller and the Carnegie Corporation, excuse me, which is still one of the big foundations I deal with on a near daily basis. It's amazing. These things have been around for a very, very, very long time. But to show you just how crazy some of this stuff is, I remember seeing that one of the board members of early Planned Parenthood, back when it was called the American Birth Control League, I forget the gentleman's name, but I shouldn't call him a gentleman. He's a wicked man. I believe his name was Theodore Lathrop Stoddard. That was his name. And he was one of the guys who actually wrote entire books on the need for, and I'm quoting, a white hierarchy or white supremacy. That was his term. These guys came up with this term. And I think it was Stoddard also, certainly one of our supporters, who came up with this idea of the overman, which is, no kidding, the word that the Nazis got, the underman, which is Untermensch, right? Yeah. And this idea of inferior people. So it comes from a time where I mentioned earlier that it's a sad word, but the incestuous relationship between all these people and organizations. And no kidding, it really is like that today. Nothing has changed all this. And I'll tell you this too. Population control, I really think it is the logical outcome of modern environmentalism, right? It started in a different place, but it's a logical outcome of global warming. And I'm not the only person who believes that. Michael Moore, a big liberal and believer in global warming, first guy to tell you he's a staunch believer that humans need to save the earth in the next dozen years or so. Michael Moore believes this. If you watch his new documentary, which has basically been banned from the left, called Planet of the Humans, he makes this grand point, better than I ever could. Thank God for him. Yes. Because he says that if you believe that the earth is getting too hot, well, wind turbines and solar panels won't save you, because they consume more resources than they're going to save in terms of degrees being heated up. You'd have to basically excavate entire third world countries in order to get the amount of copper and lithium and everything to build the batteries and all of the solar panels and all of the copper wiring that goes into these huge concrete behemoths. But this is what the left says obsequiously. They say that this is the thing that'll save us, when if they're honest, and very few of them are, they won't. And so if you follow that through, he comes to the conclusion, well, obviously, we need population control. And it reminds me of reading Margaret Sanger when she would write letters to President Calvin Coolidge saying we need to have a federal population bureau. And you can find these letters where she writes how absurd it is that a man and his wife would think it was insane for them to try and take out a mortgage on a house without being properly not licensed, but properly vetted for it, or to become a tax return guy, an accountant or something, without being properly licensed. But the idea that they can have children without being licensed by the government, absurd. It's the same kind of thinking, and we follow it all the way through to the logical conclusion. And to answer the question we started out with, what is creation care? It is really this repackaged by people who are too cynical to admit what it really is. because they know it won't sell. Nobody will buy it.
Wow. Well, Hayden, what closing words would you have for us? What should people be watching out for in regard to the creation care movement, how it intersects with the pro-abortion, population control, and the globalist movements?
Yeah, I would say search the scriptures. Do they reflect what you find? And I would say to pray on it. Does this, if it rubs you the wrong way, that this seems like, gee, when I hear somebody telling me I need to preach the whole gospel, I don't have the whole gospel, and that gospel doesn't include the free grace of a Christ who came to save sinners, you know it's not the gospel. There's no good news in it. And compare these things. Fortunately for us, these people that we're dealing with, for the most part, some of them are genuine people. Some of them we should show grace to, of course, as Christians, and show them the truth of things. Other people are con artists, and you shouldn't be deceived by them, and you should treat them as such. They're liars sowing lies. And it takes a lot of care to discern between these groups. And it's particularly difficult because it's in the context of the pulpit. It can be very difficult to see what the difference is. I would say the key thing is you always have to compare with who's winning on this, and whose agenda does this remind me of. If you look at, for instance, what most of the creation care, the logic behind the creation care campaign, where it goes, what kind of America it creates, what kind of church it creates, and what kind of people are attracted to it. What does that look like to you? To me, I see more and more the far left. I see more and more the current liberal left that's being driven by folks who scream about the need for a Green New Deal. And when you listen to what those people have to say, even those ones will tell you in rare moments of honesty, and this is coming from Sakrit Chakrabarty, who was the former chief of staff to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, it's coming from a high end. He's the author of the Green New Deal. He'll tell you, as he told the Washington Post last year, that the Green New Deal is not about the environment. It's not about global warming. It's not about saving the planet or our species. It's entirely about changing the economy. When they say change the economy, they mean something like socialism. They mean something like a complete loss of freedom, a complete takeover of the government, and a loss of religious freedom. We cannot forget that religious freedom is perhaps the most important freedom in this country, because if you don't have that, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have had a country to begin with. If we don't have that now, we won't have a country. And Christians, I think, they understand this, and they just need to be told that what they're seeing, it looks and smells and sounds exactly what they think it really looks and smells and sounds like. And I trust that the people are wise on that. I trust that the people will understand that. But I will also say this: go to capitalresearch.org. We have all of our content there. And if you love following the money and you want to learn more about these organizations, we have a sister website that we run called influencewatch.org. And Influence Watch, we have full profiles on New America Foundation, the Evangelical Environmental Network, all of these different groups, George Soros included, and we'll show you how we connect the dots and show you all the money flows, who pays for what, and what they're trying to do.
Hayden Ludwig, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We told everybody that this would be an exciting and pretty eye-opening time. You definitely made it that. I really appreciate it. You're going to continue your research into the funding of the creator movement, right?
I absolutely am. Got a long piece coming out. No ETA, but it's coming out. I'm working on it right now.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
I look forward to everything that you write. And I would just forward or further your invitation for people to go to capitalresearch.org. That's capitalresearch.org. And then influencewatch. Is that org as well? Influencewatch.org. Yes. Okay, great. You'll find loads of good ammunition there to help you to see what's going on with this stuff. We look forward to your future findings, and we'd love to have you back on the show when those start to come out.
Thank you both. Glad to be here.
All right. Friends, 1 Chronicles 12:32 refers to the sons of Issachar, one of the tribes of Israel, as men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. We need such people today who understand our troubled times and can help lead America out of the violent conflicts raging around us today. I think Hayden Ludwig is one of those people. We hope this episode of From the Stacks has helped you to understand your times. Join us again next week when Don Deers, author of the book Plexit for a Brighter Future, The Case for Withdrawing from United Nations Climate Treaties, will be our guest.